Counter-trend review. Counter Reformation.
A deliberate act of Catholic self-reflection and counterattack that has been intentionally forgotten.
Creative context.
When it comes to the topic of Christian faith, the sheer number of self-media channels mostly just retell Bible stories or fabricate sensational fake news. For example, the Ark of the Covenant has been found, Noah's Ark has been discovered, the end of the world is coming, or you've believed incorrectly. In particular, the widespread savior phenomenon is still rampant, and these influencers are quick to lecture people on how to be a good Christian. However, when it comes to church history, these channels remain conspicuously silent. This uniform avoidance of the topic exposes the unspoken secrets behind the self-media industry and the difficult predicament and lack of creativity of professional self-media content creators. However, based on the concept of the universal Christian ecumenical movement, church history is a wound that must be uncovered sooner or later, and someone must be the one to do it. Therefore, this channel is willing to take on the bigger picture, focus on church history, and courageously attempt to lift this mysterious veil. The Protestant Reformation was a secular trend of the Renaissance movement that infiltrated, corrupted, fermented, and reacted within the church. Its humanistic, liberal, nihilistic, and anarchic ideologies found a great deal of resonance within the religious community. And so, the Protestant Reformation, a Chinese cultural revolution style movement, came into being. Its beating, smashing, looting, burning, and killing swept across almost all of Europe. The brazen plundering of the Catholic Church's astronomical wealth, which has yet to be returned, is particularly noteworthy. This has allowed the original sin of primitive violence to be passed down through generations of believers. The Counter-Reformation was a comprehensive strategic counterattack launched by the Catholic Church from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century in response to the Protestant Reformation. The core of this movement was the Council of Trent, which solidified traditional Catholic doctrine while also clearing up long-standing internal corruption. The most significant result of this movement was the establishment of the Society of Jesus, a cross-border, universal missionary organization that allowed the Christian faith to break out of Europe and spread throughout the world. Through the Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books, the Counter-Reformation strengthened ideological control and maintained the unity of Catholicism. Its spirit continued until the Second Vatican Council in the mid-20th century. The movement began in 1545 and ended in 1648, lasting a total of 103 years. Its historical milestones were the start of the Council of Trent and the end of the 30 Years' War.
Historical context.
Before the Reformation, there were always internal reforms within the Catholic Church. These reforms were a form of self-purification, mainly focusing on the following areas. 1. Some monastic orders, such as the Cluniac Cistercian orders, launched a series of reforms aimed at restoring the strict discipline of monastic life, returning to the original intent of the rule of Saint Benedict, and emphasizing prayer, labor, and asceticism. 2. The development of scholasticism, especially the ideas of theologians like Thomas Aquinas, aimed to systematically explain doctrine and make theology more rigorous. 3. Some popes and bishops also tried to combat corruption within the church, such as nepotism and the sale of church offices. For example, Pope Gregory VII pushed for the Gregorian reform, which aimed to strengthen the authority of the pope and rectify the morals of the clergy. These movements reflect the Catholic Church's internal self-examination and self-reflection, as well as its attempts to solve its own problems through self-renewal. However, some people with ulterior motives, who wished to sow chaos, intentionally ignored these internal purification mechanisms and sought schism for the sake of schism. As the saying goes, he who wants to accuse can always find an excuse. In the early 16th century, the Catholic Church in Europe faced a crisis of faith triggered by the various human-centered and self-aggrandizing ideologies that had seeped in from the Renaissance. Over time, a large number of rebellious ideologies festered and became deeply ingrained within the Church. The so-called church abuses, such as the corruption of the clergy, the church's vast land holdings, and the sale of indulgences, were infinitely magnified by a microscope and increasingly sensationalized by all levels of society. If one were to look at the world with the divine eye, this was clearly an act of blatant anti-Christian behavior. Yet, at the time, it fooled and misled many uneducated people. They actually believed that the Catholic Church had seriously deviated from its sacred function. The sale of indulgences, in particular, was labeled as blasphemous to the faith by this counter-propaganda. It seems that cultured scoundrels are too vile, uncultured hooligans are too terrifying. It was in this context that in 1517, a regular Catholic priest from Germany, Martin Luther, who was a controversial figure both inside and outside the church, openly violated organizational principles and posted a big character poster in Wittenberg called the 95 Theses. This malicious event, a public and comprehensive attack on the Catholic Church, is widely considered the prelude to the modern Chinese Cultural Revolution-style Protestant Reformation. The emergence of an inside job is the greatest fear of all nations, governments, armies, institutions, and companies. And Martin Luther was just such a traitor who appeared from within the Catholic Church. It is probably difficult for future generations to understand how a highly cultivated and ordained priest could commit such an outrageous act of rebellion. The hatred the Catholic Church must have had for him can be imagined. Therefore, the bull of excommunication was also understandable. The reason is, if a son sues his father and sends him to prison, can the father forgive his son? What's more, this was done with absolute violence. The older generation of Chinese people who are still alive today are living witnesses to the Cultural Revolution and know about the twisted, despicable, dark, and vicious nature of humanity at that time. Therefore, the most ideal way to imagine and understand the Reformation is through the lens of the Cultural Revolution. Where there are people, there will be disputes, and where there are disputes, there will be arguments. However, the public sphere should be a civilized arena and a gentleman's game. After all, a gentleman uses his words, not his fists. Whoever resorts to violence first loses the moral high ground. And the Cultural Revolution-style Protestant Reformation, which began with smashing and looting and evolved into the large-scale iconoclastic movement, lost both its divine and earthly standing. In particular, the brazen plundering of legally owned Catholic Church property brought shame upon generations of believers and burdened them with original sin. Luther's thesis triggered a chain reaction at the time, leading to the rise of various Protestant denominations, including Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and Calvinism. These new belief systems rejected the authority of the Roman Curia and emphasized the individualism and liberalism of the Renaissance. This posed an unprecedented challenge to the legitimacy of the Catholic Church. Indeed, it is difficult for modern people to understand the madness of the Cultural Revolution. But it is even more difficult to understand the tyranny of the schism back then. How could such a flagrant anti-church, anti-order, and body-tearing anti-Christian conspiracy be ignored? Was it a case of being blind to the truth, or was it demonic possession?
Counter Reformation versus Catholic Reform.
The nature of the Counter Reformation movement is seen from two main perspectives in historical circles, which are reflected in the two different concepts: Counter-Reformation and Catholic Reform. The term Counter-Reformation is often used by Protestants and some historians to emphasize the movement's confrontational nature. It focuses on the measures the Church took to suppress the expansion of Protestantism, eradicate heresy, and reclaim lost ground, such as the doctrinal solidification at the Council of Trent and the strengthening of the Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books. From this perspective, the core of the movement was an act of counterattack and suppression, representing the Catholic Church's forceful measures to maintain its existing rules. In contrast, the term Catholic Reform is preferred by many Catholics and other historians to highlight the movement's internal and spontaneous nature. This view points out that reform efforts already existed within the Catholic Church long before Martin Luther's appearance. For example, the religious awakening in Spain at the end of the 15th century, led by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II and Isabella I. The Oratory of Divine Love founded in Rome in 1517 by Italian reformers. The motivation behind these early reforms was to reform life, not doctrine, focusing on cleaning up internal corruption and improving the moral standards of the clergy. The essence of this counter-reformation can be understood as a convergence of internal reform and external counterattack. The Protestant Reformation acted as a powerful catalyst, forcing the Catholic Church to seriously confront its internal issues and transform long-held desires for reform into systematic, institutional action. This was both a fierce response to an external challenge and a profound self-reflection on internal flaws. This complex structure of motives is key to understanding all the subsequent decisions, whether they were the solidification of doctrine or the restructuring of discipline. As the saying goes, there is no pure gold and no perfect person. The church is, after all, made up of human beings. To demand absolute perfection from the church is therefore non-materialistic or even malicious troublemaking. The reason is simple. Everyone has seen that after the schism, did the new denominations achieve absolute perfection. On the contrary, the sheer number of different sects alone has seriously damaged the holy image of Christianity, giving outsiders the impression of a chaotic and disorganized mess.
The Council of Trent.
The convocation of the Council of Trent was a long and difficult process. There were calls for a general council to resolve the church crisis as early as 1517. However, continuous political struggles between the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, as well as between France and Germany, repeatedly delayed the meeting. Charles V, a fierce opponent of the Reformation, also postponed the council several times to secure the support of the German Protestant princes against the Ottoman Turkish threat. Ultimately, Pope Paul III agreed to convene the General Council in Trento, Italy, in 1545. The council took place in 3 sessions and did not conclude until 1563, lasting nearly 20 years. The Council of Trent made clear and uncompromising doctrinal decisions as a formal response to the core theological principles of Protestantism. 1. Rejection of faith alone. In response to Martin Luther's claim of justification by faith alone, the Council explicitly rejected this doctrine and declared that those who held this view should be excommunicated. The Council reaffirmed that salvation is a process of cooperation between the believer and God's grace, requiring both faith and good works. 2. Rejection of Scripture alone. In the face of the Protestant principle of sola scriptura, the Council of Trent emphasized that Scripture and sacred tradition have equal authority. It also reaffirmed that the Church has the sole right to interpret the Bible and opposed private interpretation. 3. Confirmation of the sacraments. The Council reconfirmed the 7 sacraments of Catholicism, in stark contrast to the Protestant practice of retaining only 2, baptism and the Eucharist. 4. Reaffirmation of authority. The Council explicitly affirmed the supreme status of the Pope among all Christians. It also reaffirmed Jerome's Latin Vulgate Bible as the authoritative version of the Bible, in opposition to the Protestant adoption and alteration of the original Hebrew and Greek texts. Additionally, the Council rejected the Protestant concept of the priesthood of all believers, emphasizing that only qualified bishops and priests have the authority to represent the Church and grant absolution. In addition to doctrinal solidification, the Council of Trent also undertook deep-seated reforms of the Church's internal discipline and administration. 1. Clearing corruption. The Council finally abolished the long controversial sale of indulgences. It also took measures to prohibit the extravagant lifestyles of the clergy and forbid nepotism. 2. Strengthening pastoral office. One of the most important provisions was the requirement that bishops must reside in their own dioceses, thereby eliminating the abuse of bishops holding multiple positions and failing to properly fulfill their pastoral duties. The Council also emphasized that the clergy, especially bishops, should focus more on preaching and shepherding their congregations. 3. Ensuring the future. One of the most far-sighted decisions was the requirement that every diocese, under the guidance of the Church, must establish a seminary to provide formal, systematic education for future clergy. This aimed to cultivate a new generation of disciplined and doctrinally sound clergy, fundamentally solving the problem of uneven quality among the clergy. The reforms of the Council of Trent were not merely about purify the Church. Their deeper meaning was to re-solidify the Church's authoritative system through standardization and centralization. These two seemingly independent actions were actually interconnected, working together toward a single core goal: to reshape the unity of the Catholic Church. The essence of this internal reform was a response to the decentralized theology and organizational model of Protestantism. Through the solidification of discipline, the Catholic Church achieved the solidification of doctrine, thereby creating a more powerful, unified, and effective institutional entity to counter external challenges. In short, the reforms of the Council of Trent made the Protestant schism's theoretical basis irrelevant.
The birth of the Jesuits and global evangelization.
The Counter Reformation could not have succeeded without a crucial force, the Society of Jesus. This order was founded by the Spanish nobleman Saint Ignatius of Loyola in 1534 and officially approved by the Pope in 1540. In addition to the three traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits made a unique fourth vow: absolute obedience to the Pope. This highly centralized, militarized organizational structure allowed them to respond swiftly to the Pope's calls, becoming his elite troops in the fight against Protestantism. The historical context of the Jesuits' birth was purely for competing with Protestants. Their mission was to win souls, to gain everyone who could breathe. Since Europe was already saturated, they decided to open up other virgin territories in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For instance, Christian faith was first brought to China by the Jesuit Matteo Ricci. Therefore, the Jesuits, at the very least, played a foundational role in establishing the Christian faith in China. The Jesuits placed education at the core of their mission. They believed that by providing high-quality education, they could cultivate people's rationality, enabling them to make correct decisions and leading them away from heretical ideas. They had a famous saying, "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man." To achieve this strategy, the Jesuits established a vast network of colleges and seminaries throughout Europe. Starting with the first college in Sicily in 1548, the number of colleges had grown to 476 and seminaries to 36 by 1626. By 1750, there were 669 colleges in France alone. This vast educational system was not only a cradle for training loyal clergy but also a crucial fortress for countering the infiltration of Protestant ideas and maintaining the dominance of Catholic thought. The Jesuits were also the vanguards of Catholic overseas missions, spreading the gospel to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This enabled Catholicism to achieve global expansion, partly compensating for the territory lost in Europe due to the rise of Protestantism. The key to their missionary success was their unique cultural adaptation strategy. 1. India. The missionary Roberto de Nobili arrived in India and, by immersing himself in the local language and culture, even adopting the attire and customs of Hindu priests such as wearing a topknot, a saffron robe, and a forehead mark, successfully gained the trust of the Indian people, leading to the conversion of thousands. 2. China. Matteo Ricci was the most brilliant practitioner of this strategy. He arrived in Macau in 1582, then traveled deep into mainland China. He won the respect of the scholar official class by mastering the Chinese language, wearing Confucian scholar robes, and introducing Western scientific knowledge like maps, astronomy, and mathematics. Ricci collaborated with Chinese scholars such as Suguanqi to translate Western classics like Euclid's Elements, and even coined terms like point, line, surface, plane, and curve, which are still used today. This not only laid the foundation for the spread of Catholicism in China but also initiated a new era of cultural exchange known as Western learning, spreading eastward in early modern China. The Jesuit missionary strategy, especially its cultural adaptation method, went beyond simple religious propagation. It represented an unprecedented model of global dialogue, whose influence extended beyond the religious sphere and became a foundational force for cultural exchange between the East and West in the early modern period. Therefore, the Jesuits' global missionary movement was both an external expression of the Counter Reformation and a key point in early modern global cultural exchange. Its significance far transcends religion itself. It proves that in certain historical contexts, a cultural strategy of seeking common ground while respecting differences can have a more profound historical impact than mere religious confrontation.
Baroque art.
The Reformation emphasized simplicity, and more simplicity, demanding only that churches be plain, not that clergy's mansions be modest. This led to a complete stripping of artistic decoration from the interiors of Protestant churches. They were left with nothing but bare walls, a step away from being ruins. In response, the Catholic Church went in the opposite direction, using art as a key tool for display. Thus, Baroque art was born. Its style is known for its grand scale, dramatic changes, three-dimensional prominence, and strong contrasts. This art style aimed to directly inspire a sense of religious awe in the viewer through sensory impact. For example, Bernini's sculpture The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa uses a twisting posture and strong contrasts of light and shadow to capture the subject's religious rapture, aiming to make believers feel a mystical, transcendent religious experience. In architecture and urban planning, the papacy undertook large-scale construction in Rome to reshape the city's glory and emphasize the Pope's authority and divine origin. These magnificent structures, such as Bernini's design for St. Peter's Square and its fountains, created a grand, sublime, and vibrant urban landscape that re-inspired people with the authority and glory of Catholicism. The core of Baroque art was the deliberate creation of an impression that Catholic churches were grand imperial halls and God's palaces, while Protestant churches were humble shacks and chiefs' hovels. This contrast was also evident in the solemnity of their ceremonial rites. The results were quite striking, especially in the age of the Internet, when some Protestant believers stumble upon videos of grand Catholic ceremonies and compare them to the crude simplicity of their own churches. The contrast is like that between a professional and an amateur. Furthermore, Protestant worship has become severely secularized. People wear extremely revealing clothing to the altar and sway their hips while singing. It is precisely these things that have led many people to convert to Catholicism.
Strengthening orthodoxy.
The 30 Years' War was the most brutal and bloody internal conflict of the Christian world during the Counter Reformation. It began as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire. However, the war gradually evolved into a power struggle among European nations, with religious beliefs taking a backseat. What is most intriguing is that Catholic France, in its effort to weaken the powerful Habsburg dynasty, allied with Protestant nations to fight against the Catholic camp. This chaotic conflict ended with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The treaty established the principle of state sovereignty, meaning cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. It marked the end of religion's dominant role in international politics. Thereafter, European state relations were no longer primarily determined by religious faith but by secular national interests. In addition to spiritual influence and military confrontation, the Counter-Reformation also used coercive means to maintain doctrinal orthodoxy, primarily through the Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books. The Roman Inquisition was granted the power to interrogate and punish heretics, using harsh methods to suppress Protestants and dissenters. The Index of Forbidden Books, a list of books forbidden for Catholics to read, was published by Pope Paul IV in 1559. This index banned about 3/4 of all printed books in Europe at the time. The Catholic Church used this to control the spread of information and ideas, which caused many printers to flee to Protestant regions. The great success of the Catholic Church in culture and art could not reverse its inability to control the schism, which ultimately led to the modern European order of separation of church and state. The two great schisms of the Christian world were certainly the sins of the unity of church and state. The so-called doctrinal differences were all excuses, self-deceiving pretexts for schism. To avoid a future great schism, the separation of church and state became a necessity.
Related apparitions and miraculous events.
Using apparitions and miracles to promote orthodoxy is a consistent strategy of the Catholic Church. It's a way of saying, I have something you don't. The period of the Counter-Reformation was not only accompanied by doctrinal debates, political maneuvering, and bloody wars, but also by a large number of religious apparitions, miraculous events, and mystical experiences. These phenomena were described as signs from heaven or responses to heresy. For example, Marian apparitions. During the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church placed increasing emphasis on the veneration of the Virgin Mary. Many apparitions of the Virgin were widely publicized during this period. For example, the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico in 1531. The Virgin Mary appeared to the indigenous man Juan Diego. This was a very important religious event during the colonization of Latin America, used to sanctify Spain's universal missionary activities. In this apparition, the Virgin Mary's image contained local indigenous cultural elements, which strengthened the spread of the faith. The event occurred at the beginning of the Reformation. The Catholic Church widely promoted this event during the Counter-Reformation as a symbol of the legitimacy of its global mission. Stigmata phenomena. This refers to the appearance on the bodies of certain saints or devout believers of wounds corresponding to those of Jesus during the Passion, such as bleeding from the hands, feet, and side, often called the 5 holy wounds. The most famous cases include 1. St. John of the Cross, a Spanish Carmelite mystic who worked closely with Saint Teresa of Avila. He is often associated with spiritual experiences such as mystical union, religious ecstasy, and visions. His writings became a cornerstone of mystical theology during the Counter Reformation. 2. Saint Catherine of Siena. Although she lived slightly before the Counter Reformation, her experience with stigmata was widely cited during this period as a mark of true faith. Demonic possession and exorcism. During the Counter Reformation, the Catholic Church emphasized orthodox belief, arguing that heretics and Protestants were susceptible to demonic temptation. Exorcism rituals became extremely important. 1. The Loudon possessions, France, 1630s. Several nuns were possessed by demons. The priest Urbain Grandier was accused of making a pact with the devil and performing magic, and was ultimately burned at the stake. The case received wide attention and was seen as a nexus of political and religious struggle. 2. Mystical experiences and visions. Saint Teresa of Avila. A Spanish Carmelite reformer and a key figure of mysticism. One of the central figures of the Counter-Reformation, widely promoted by the Catholic Church. Her mystical experiences included the interior voice of God, visions and religious ecstasy, out-of-body and mystical union experiences with God. Her work The Interior Castle became a spiritual classic of the Counter-Reformation era. Weeping statues and miracles. While combating the Protestant iconoclasm, the Catholic Church particularly emphasized the sacredness and active nature of holy images. Many churches reported that statues of the Virgin Mary and Christ wept or bled. These were seen as symbols of divine intervention, used to persuade believers to return to Catholicism. There are also some controversial psychic phenomena, such as the defenestration of Prague, which triggered the 30 Years' War. 3 Catholic emissaries were thrown out of a castle window 20 meters high by local Protestants. Miraculously, the 3 emissaries were unharmed. They stood up and rode off, disappearing into the distance at an incredible speed. They got away right in front of everyone's eyes. This channel's earlier videos describe this story in detail. The Catholic Church believes this event was a miracle. However, Protestants have numerous explanations, all suggesting that the 3 men landed in a soft spot. Unfortunately, this is likely a militarily ignorant sophistry, because 1. Ancient castles were permanent fortifications built for war, often located on mountaintops or high ground near rivers. 2. The area around the castle was often built with smooth, sloping masonry to take advantage of the terrain. 3. Only with a smooth slope could the effectiveness of the defenders' rolling logs and rocks be maximized. 4. During wartime, these slopes were doused with water to create ice in winter and with oil in summer to make them slick. This was to prevent enemy soldiers from getting a foothold to climb and attack the castle. 5. Therefore, there could not have been a soft spot around the castle. A soft spot would absorb water and oil and help enemies get a foothold. 6. Even if, contrary to common sense, there was grass planted on the slope, a living person falling from a height of 20 meters could not possibly be completely unharmed and immediately run off, leaving their pursuers in the dust. Such a scene could only happen in a movie. So, whether this story is a miracle or a blunder, the audience probably knows the answer.
The call of history.
The evaluation of the Counter-Reformation is always a multi-dimensional one. From a positive perspective, the movement eliminated many of the Church's internal abuses, such as the sale of indulgences and the extravagant lifestyles of the clergy. It revitalized the piety of believers and allowed Catholicism to continue its status as the orthodox Christian faith through global evangelization. In this sense, it successfully halted the further expansion of Protestantism and even led to the return of Catholicism in some regions. However, from a negative perspective, the movement's hardline approach deepened the rifts in the Christian world and intensified religious persecution and conflict. The Index of Forbidden Books and the Inquisition, implemented to maintain doctrinal orthodoxy, were seen by some as coercive acts that stifled intellectual freedom and hindered the progress of civilization. The movement ultimately created the religious divide in Europe, with Northern Europe converting to Protestantism and Southern Europe remaining Catholic. The decrees of the Council of Trent shaped the face of Catholicism for the next 400 years. Its doctrinal positions were not re-examined and adjusted until the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, in the 20th century. Vatican to 1960 to 1965 is referred to by historians as the most significant historical event in 400 years because it was dedicated to the modernization of the Catholic Church. Vatican II broke with the tradition of complete isolationism formed during the Counter Reformation. It advocated for dialogue with Christian denominations outside of Catholicism, with other religions, and even with non-religious people. The enculturation spirit of Vatican II has deep historical roots in the cultural adaptation strategy pioneered by Jesuits like Matteo Ricci in their early missions. On the surface, the Counter-Reformation adopted a closed and rigid strategy, while Vatican II adopted an open and dialogical approach. The two seem diametrically opposed. However, Vatican II's openness was a direct response to the problem of the Church becoming disconnected from the modern world, which was caused by the Counter-Reformation's long-term isolationist strategy. The Counter-Reformation successfully maintained the Church's unity for 400 years through internal discipline and doctrinal solidification. This stability provided the institutional foundation for Vatican II to boldly undertake its modernization attempts. Furthermore, despite their opposing strategies, both movements were dedicated to the core goal of the revitalization of Catholicism. The Council of Trent sought revitalization through counterattack, while Vatican II sought it through dialogue. Together, they form a complete picture of Catholicism's transition from the medieval to the modern world. The Counter-Reformation provided Catholicism with the identity and foundation to survive in the modern world, while Vatican II pointed out the path for its continued development in a pluralistic world.
Postscript.
The Counter-Reformation was a major event in the history of the Catholic Church. It left a profound mark on its doctrine, institutions, culture, and global missionary outreach. Its essence was both a defensive counterattack and a proactive renewal. It solidified Catholic doctrine and maintained its dominant authority in Southern Europe and globally. Through the 30 Years' War, it also indirectly contributed to the modern political landscape of sovereign nation-states. In the cultural sphere, it used Baroque art as a weapon to re-engage the emotions of believers, becoming a cultural artifact used to humble Protestants.